Okay, today's daf is daf kaf in Sheqalim. We're going to start at the very bottom of Yud Tet Amud Bet where we left off yesterday. Rav Nachat L'Taman. We're talking more about these issues of sefekot, where you have meat that's found or meat that we don't know exactly where it's been, meat that's found somewhere. How do we identify it? How do we treat it halachically? So it says that Rav came there, okay, and in other words, this is talking about when Rav came to a new city, and it says Hamtun Mekilin the Hamar Alehin. He saw that they were very lenient. They were too lenient when he came to Babylonia. When he moved to Babylonia from Israel, he saw that they were very lenient, so he had to be strict with them. Chad bar nash azil. So now we turn to Kaf Amud Aleph. There was a certain person who came Ba'el Mishizga Askifte Begon Nahara. He wanted to clean. He wanted to wash off in the ocean, or in the river rather. So he wanted to wash off his meat. His meat was, the meat, you wash it, you clean it. So he had to wash the meat in the river. What happened was in Shita that he dropped it there. Okay, he left it there, and then Va'azile Chazar by Misvina. So he left the meat unattended, and then he came back. And he wanted to take the meat. Amar le Rav. Rav said, Asur lecha dara, you can't take it. Because Amar hahi shatafna Rav aiti chored nevela tachtoi. Because you know what happens? You left your meat there to clean off in the river. Actually, it got swept away, and this is a new piece of meat. How do you know it's not a new piece of meat? Maybe a new piece of meat came as nevela. It's not kosher. So this is the concept of basar shenitalim min ha'ayin. It's a halachic concept that it's actually a big machloket in Masechet Chulin. Also, Bava Metzia talks about it. That this concept of basar shenitalim min ha'ayin, which means if meat is left unattended, then we have to presume the worst all the time. And it's a machloket. And Rav holds that basar shenitalim min ha'ayin is asur. You can't. Once you take your eyes off the meat, you can't eat it anymore. So since this guy leaves the meat, even though he left it in that exact spot, it looks like the same meat. It's sitting on the same rock in the river. It doesn't matter. We don't really know for sure that it was not a different meat. Chad bar nash, another person, he was walking in the shuk, he was walking in the marketplace. Ta'in a kupat, he was holding some meat. Ata dayeta, a certain bird came and tried to grab it from him. Utilaktein dropped it. Chazar by misvina, so he wanted to pick up the piece of meat off the ground and eat it. Amar le Rav. Rav said, no, asur lechatana, you can't. Why not? Amar basur denevela havat ta'ina, because you know what happened? That bird was carrying a different piece of meat. Utilaktein dropped that piece of meat. Venasvahu ochrana, and dropped you another one. In other words, it took your meat and dropped its meat. How do you know that piece of meat is the same? Maybe that bird wanted to switch its meat with your meat. So it came to grab your meat, and actually you think that it dropped your meat back into your hands, but it could be that it dropped a different piece of meat.
This concept makes no sense based on the fact that right before then we learn about the market, like if
right.
There's a lot bigger chance, probability that you have a problem there than here.
You see a bird
right?
that brings meat.
Right.
Versus,
I never did. Usually the birds, they only poop on you.
If you have 1 of 10, definitely non-kosher butcher.
Right. You're right. Yeah. So Rav is talking at is making a gezerah. It says that it even says Hamtun Mekilin. He saw they were too lenient. So the Hamar Alehin, he became very strict about the rule. So really, the law of the Mishnah is much more lenient,
more stringent.
The Mishnah law is much more stringent. It's much more lenient rather. Rav is coming along with this very stringent idea of basar shenitalim min ha'ayin that I mentioned. It's a machloket in the Gemara. Not here. It's a machloket in Bava Metzia.
It can be much lenient because we're talking about areas that there are a lot of Jews.
Well, that's right. So many of those laws wouldn't apply today anyway because we don't live in areas with Jews. But anyway, Amar le Rav. So Rav said he couldn't take the meat. So now Ginai Shataf. Okay, Shataf Zikin. So that what happened was that in a city called Ginai, there was some kind of a flood, and many barrels of wine were washed away. This situation came in front of Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Elazar. V'amar yachkemun shafaya kitarhon. So what happened was, he said, have the professionals check their knots. In other words, if you can identify, since the kosher wine got swept away, let's say in this flood, now we find nodot shel yayin. It wasn't barrels. It was like they used to use skin. They would have, what do you call that? I can't remember the English word for it, but basically the nodot yayin means that they had it made out of skin, a container that they make out of skin, and they would tie it and have the wine inside. So what happened was that when they found these skins filled with wine, he said if they can identify from the kesher, from the tie, from the knot on top of the wine, that this is in fact kosher wine, then fine. If they can't, then no. And that's, like today we have the special seals that the Vad puts on things, and that's how we're able to tell that it's genuine. Or when you buy the Empire chicken, it has the metal thing inside the tag, inside the chicken, to show you that it's kasher. So here too he says if they can identify the knots, then you can drink the wine. And again, it says nikunika ishtakach beknishta debuli, that it once happened that they found a can, in other words, a container full of wine in the Bet Knesset of Buli. And the situation came before Rabbi Yirmiyah. Amar Yitchakemon Sikuraya Aviditon. So he says that they should check. They should ask those who make the markings on the cans. In other words, if they can tell that this is the seal, in other words, they would put certain indications on the outside of the can. They would write certain things or put certain symbol on there. If they can tell that that's in fact one that they signed off on, and that that's their writing, that's their inscription, then you're allowed to drink the wine because that's a valid siman that this is in fact the kosher wine and not non-kosher. So one time they found a roasted gedi, a roasted kid. Not a human kid, but a sheep, and this was in Gufta, a place called Gufta. They found it in the middle of the street, Bisratia de Gufta. And what happened? Vitiruhu, and they allowed it mishum shnei devarim, because of two reasons. Mishum mitzia, mishum rov malachei drachim, because there were two problems. Problem number one is because of mitzia. In other words, you found an entire roasted sheep. Don't you have to return it to its owner? How can you just keep it? In other words, because of mitziyah, because of hashavat aveda, shouldn't you have to return it? That's question number one. Number two is, how do you know if it's kasher or not? So they had two answers to that. In other words, they allowed it on both counts. Mishum mitziyah detanei hamatzil miyad ha'ari miyad ha'gais mishunat hayam mishunat hanahar ומיסרתיה גדולה ומפלטיה גדולה הרי אלו שלא מפני שהבעלים מתייאשים מהן. So number one, we're not concerned about having to return it to its owner because of a principle that we have. If you save something from a lion, you see a lion walking around with something and you save it from him, or you see that an army, an invading army, you take something from them, or the ocean carries something, or the river carries something, or you find something in an open space, an open street, or an open plaza, you can take it. Why? Because whoever lost that thing that the lion has didn't ever expect to get it back. He was mityaesh. Yeush means he gave up on it. Yeush, he gave up on it. When the lion took it, it's like they say, what time is it when an elephant sits on your watch? Time to get a new watch, right? What time is it when a lion takes your anything? Time to get a new one. You're not going to get it back from the lion. So if you were lucky enough that you got something away from the lion, you can keep it. Because whoever owned it originally, they gave up already. And if you drop something, we know, you drop something in the middle of the street, you don't expect to ever get it back. It's not going to be there when you come back. Most of the time. So therefore, taking it is not considered stealing. There's no mitzvah to return it. Because whoever left it there knows they're not going to get it back. And why are we not concerned that it might not be kasher, based on this idea of basar shnei talem and ayin, which we just said before? So he says, because the reason is, mishum rov me'alechei drachim, mishum shechitat nochri. Okay, in other words, that we don't have to worry that it was slaughtered by a non-Jew. In other words, you don't have to worry that it's not kasher. Why not? Because the majority of the people who go by that place are Jews. And therefore, since the majority are Jews, we can rely on the fact that it came from a Jewish source, that it came from a kasher source. Now, you can either say that these are two different views, that Rav was being machmir. In other words, Rav was being machmir, or that Rav only applied his halakha in a situation where the majority of people going around were not Jewish, and that's why anytime you take your eye off the meat, he assumes it came from a non-kosher source. Either that's the reason, it's contextual, that everyone agrees on the halakha, but in Rav's case, he was talking about a situation where the majority of meat in circulation was not kasher, and therefore you have to assume the worst. And here we're talking about where the majority of meat is kasher. That's one way to answer it. The other simpler way to explain it is that everybody agrees on the basic halakha, but Rav was coming around, like it says in the beginning of the sugya, lehachmir. He was trying specifically to be stringent, to make people be more careful, because he noticed laxity among the people.
Just to be clear, he would not agree with the 9 and the 10 then.
What's
would not agree.
Well, no, that's what I'm saying. Either either he's saying that it doesn't that he doesn't agree. He's being more machmir than the actual halacha.
In which case he would not.
Or he's saying that. In other words, either he doesn't agree either they're talking about two different cases. In other words, he's talking in a case where the majority of meat around is not 9 out of 10.
Which would leave the question.
Which he could still agree with the 9.
But that's what I'm saying. How could he agree here and not there?
Or it could just be that he's being more machmir, which is what I think it is. I think that really he agrees with the basic halacha, but he's saying, I want it to be machmir because people are taking it too leniently. Yeah. He didn't like that. So then it said, yeah.
So his bird in the woods is his attempt to tighten up.
To tighten up on the people.
Those other things, like, in
people are being too lenient. Yeah, people are being too lenient.
To tighten up those things.
Yeah, he felt that was getting, it sounds like he thought that it was making people too lax. Oh yeah, I could find a piece of meat anywhere. They were getting lax. So he wanted to tighten up the shop. So then it says, Debet Rabbi de Guvna Ishtak. I'm sorry, what happened here? Where am I here? Where are we? Which there seems like an extra word here. Yeah, right. We had that already, So, min the Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi, he says on the side, instead of. Right. So it says the Bet Rabbi. Where does the sentence start? V'ishtakach min debet Rabbi igul de guvna.
Yes, that's the
okay.
Of the paragraph.
Okay. Ishtakach bepundaka de Levi. Okay. So apparently, okay, I see. So is it saying that they lost it?
And indeed it was.
And it was found in the end. That's funny because the ishtakach usually means found in Aramaic. It doesn't usually mean lost. Okay. That's why I got confused. Okay. So therefore, he says that some roll of cheese, some cheese was lost from the house of Rebbe, and it showed up in the pundak, in the inn of Levi. And they allowed it because of two things: because of finding of a lost object, and because of the majority of people. So number one, since this was lost in an open public place and it showed up in an inn, whoever found it was allowed to keep it because we assume that whoever lost it is not looking for it anymore. So that's number one. And mishum gvinat nochri, we're not concerned that it might not be kosher cheese because all the cheese going around, the majority of cheese in circulation in that area is kosher cheese. That wouldn't be true today if you just found a piece of cheese in the middle of the mall. You wouldn't assume that it was kosher, but in a situation like this, you could assume that. And vishtakach min de Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi Am Rabbi Mana Kumi Rabbi Yossi V'anan Chamian Rabbanan Machrizin. So it happened that Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi found something like this, and Rabbi Mani said in front of Rabbi Yossi, "Don't we see the rabbis announce this when they find things?" Okay? In other words, if they find lost objects, they announce it. Amar le at in havita mishkach lo nasvat. He said to him, "If you found it, wouldn't you keep it? Why are you telling me to announce it? I found it, I want to keep it." He said, would you announce it? Rabbi Yonah, avuch, lo amarken. Okay, he said, Rabbi Yonah, your father didn't say that. Ela amar halvai kad nishkach. Nishkach min piusa ulegava. So he said, your father, Rabbi Yonah said, I hope that I find some nice, stuff, and I hope I find it in a place where it's considered to be forgotten about. In other words, I hope I find it in the area where I don't have to announce it and I can assume that it was forgotten by the owner so I can keep it. Right? So he's saying, and now you're telling me I found this food, I want to keep it. Right? So why are you telling me to announce it and see if anybody recognizes the piece of meat or the piece of cheese? So he said to him, even so, he wouldn't have taken it. He would have been stringent and he would have announced it. In other words, he was saying, yeah, I wish I could do that. But really, push comes to shove, if he found it, he would have announced it because he would have wanted to fulfill his ethical obligation that maybe the owner was still around and would want to come pick it up. So even though technically, according to the law, since the owner has given up hope on this, he would be allowed to let it go. He might not want to. He might not actually do that in practice. Now the new Mishnah says, "Behemash and Yerushalayim, v'ad migdal eder uchemidat lechol ruach." that if a person finds an animal from Jerusalem until Migdal Eder, and that distance in every direction, Zecharim Olot, if he finds a male animal, we assume that it's a Korban Olah. Nekevot Zivchei Shelamim. If we find female animals, we assume they are Shelamim. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Haroil Psachim Psachim, Kodem L'Regel Lamed Yom. If you find something that could be a Korban Pesach 30 days before Pesach, it can be offered as a Pesach. In the beginning, if somebody found, let's say, a Korban, somebody found a male animal right around Jerusalem, and he has to assume that it's a Korban Olah. So he has to give it as a Korban Olah. They used to force him to pay for the Nisachim, for the wine that goes with it. So after a while, what would happen? So people would find an animal and they would run away. They wouldn't return it. Why? Because if I show up with this animal, you're going to make me pay for it. And it wasn't even mine. I found it on the street. So therefore, they made a takana. They made a law that anytime you find a lost korban and you're returning it to the Beit HaMikdash, the Beit HaMikdash will pay for whatever the costs are associated with it. Amar Rabbi Shimon says, there were 7 things that the rabbis instituted, and this was one of them. That if a non-Jew sends sacrifices and he sends money with it for the nisachim to pay for whatever expenses, the libations and so on that have to be brought, we use the money that he sent. If he didn't send the money, we don't reject this korban. This non-Jew who sent it, we take the korban and we pay for the extra stuff. And similarly, if a convert to Judaism died and he left sacrifices that he meant to give, now it's going to be hard to go to his family who are not Jewish and ask them to pay for it. If he had set aside also money or items to be used for the libations, then we'll take it. If not, then we cover for it, because we know that his family might not understand this idea of korbanot because they're not Jewish, and so we take care of it for him. And we have the Beit Din made a condition on a Kohen Gadol that dies, that his mincha should be offered from the community. In other words, the Kohen Gadol had a mincha that he offered every day. He would bring 1/10 of an ephah. Half of it would be offered in the morning, half of it would be offered in the evening. And so let's say the Kohen Gadol dies, so the community will pay for that korban to continue to be offered. Let's say, for example, he brought his offering in the morning and then he didn't have a chance to bring it in the evening, so he died. So now in the afternoon, what do? We haven't appointed a new Kohen Gadol yet who's going to take over, so the community will pay for that offering to be brought. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mishal Yorashin, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, actually, until they choose a new Kohen Gadol, we go to his heirs, those who inherited his estate, and we say to them, well, normally the Kohen Gadol would pay for this. You have to pay for it until we appoint a new Kohen Gadol, and so whoever inherits the estate has to pay for it. So there's a machloket. Does the community cover it until a new Kohen Gadol is chosen, or do the heirs of the previous Kohen Gadol continue to be responsible for it until such time as they select a new Kohen Gadol, which we don't know how long that's going to be.
The children.
Yeah, the children first. So ushlema haytakreva ala melach ushlema haytakreva, and it was brought complete. In other words, what does that mean? That normally when the Kohen Gadol would bring his offering, he would take the 1/10 of an ephah and he would split it in half. And he would offer half of it in the morning and half of it in the evening. Now that there's no Kohen Gadol, he died and he didn't have a chance to bring it yet. So we go to, let's say, either the communal fund pays for the flour instead of the Kohen Gadol, obviously because he's not here, or the Yorashim, the inheritors of the estate of the Kohen Gadol, will pay for it. Now what do? Instead of splitting it in half, because there's no Kohen Gadol to fulfill the mitzvah of splitting it in half, they just offered it shlema. They just offered the Asiri Taifa, they would just offer it as one sacrifice. They didn't split it. That was only done when there was a Kohen Gadol available. Ala melach ve'ala aitzim. This is continuing with the takanot that the Beit Din made. Also, they made a condition on the salt and on the wood, sheyu kohanim neotin bahen, that the kohanim were allowed to use it. In other words, the wood and the salt in the Beit HaMikdash, if the kohanim needed, there were certain korbanot that they had to eat in the Beit HaMikdash, like the korban chata. They were allowed to prepare the meat however they wanted. So let's say they wanted to roast it. They didn't have to bring wood from home. They could use the wood from the Beit HaMikdash. If they needed to salt the meat a little bit, it was bland, they could take the salt that was used for the korbanot, and they were allowed to use it. That was a Tanai Beit Din. The Beit Din made a condition on it that they would be allowed to use it. So the Kiddusha had a limit in some respect. So we're going to see what that means, that it says about the parah. the para aduma, that they wouldn't, that one who misappropriated or benefited from the efer, benefited from the ashes of the para, would not commit me'ilah, would not commit the prohibition of misappropriation. We'll see what that is exactly soon. This is something we learned about yesterday. What they would do was they would collect the money from, they would have a collection case that women would come who needed to bring the two birds. One is an olah, one is a chatat. That they would bring it in order to complete their purification after giving birth. So they would deposit the money. And from that money they would take one olah and one chatat for each person who left the money. Now, what happens if one of those korbanot ends up being pasul, and the woman already left? Because they would just leave the money. It was up to the kohanim to offer all the sacrifices. So what happens if it ends up being pasul? So it says that the tzibur had a backup fund to cover those situations, that they would provide more birds to the people because they were already gone. Alternatively, Rabbi Yossi Omer, that whoever it was that provided the kinin, whoever it was that normally was the provider of the birds, was responsible for making sure if any of them were pasul. These are the bird korbanot, the pair. That's talking about the bird korbanot, because Masechet Kinim is very hard. It's very complicated. It's birds. Yeah, bird korbanot, the pair that they would bring. So, whoever was responsible for providing the birds is responsible for providing extra in the event that one of them comes out pasul. Okay, so these are all takanot that they had, all various laws that they...
The birds has to do the backup? I thought
right, in other words, it's a contract that they have with him that if one of them ends up being invalid, then the supplier has to supply a new one. It's a machloket. There's two opinions. Opinion number one was that the community had funds for that. Opinion number two was that they had a contract with the supplier that if anyone became pasul, he would automatically provide them with additional ones. Either way, they covered for it, because the point was that the woman went home. She assumes that everything is done, and really, one of them was pasul, and sorry... They can't leave it like that. They have to fix it. They have to offer it for her. So they would be what's called makneh. They would have to buy another korban, transfer ownership of it to whomever it was that had given the money that had already gone home, so that it belonged to them, and brought the korban in their stead. So now we come to the Gemara. Rabbi Hoshaya Rabba Amar. Lavo bidmehen shanu. This whole thing in the beginning of the Mishnah that says that if you find male animals, you assume they're korbanot, they're olah, they're olot. If you find female animals, you assume shilamim. It says that doesn't mean that you actually offer them as a korban olah, because there's still a chance that it's not a korban olah. How do you know? What does it mean? Lavo bidmehen. It means you take the money. In other words, you take some money and you say that if whatever kedusha this is, I want it to go. I'm dedicating this money as korban olah money, right? The value. In other words, you redeem it. What?
Well, it's
not tmurah, because tmurah is when you take another animal.
As an olah, it could be olah or shlamim as olah. One is consumed and the other one.
Right, they're different. They're different. So you take money.
You don't know, and you make it an olah.
What it means is you take the money.
It's a higher kedusha.
Right, it's a higher one. So you take money and you say. That you're dedicating this as an olah to remove the kedusha from these animals, since you're not exactly sure what they were meant to be. Okay.
An olah is just not the same level.
It's not an olah because it's a shlamim.
Shlamim, right.
Right. So we don't actually bring the korban. So like the korban haydah says, klomar ihi vaday lo kreva. You definitely can't bring the animal as what you think it is, because you don't really know. So what you have to do is, the takana is that whoever finds it has to say, I'm going to take the money, and he explains it like this. He says, you take the money, and what you do is you redeem this animal, transferring its kedusha to the money, and he says that then you have to take the value and you have to purchase a korban olah. So you don't offer the actual animal that you found. That's the logic. So Amar le Rabbi Yochanan says, Omrim lo Adam, tzeu ma'ol b'kodashim. How could you say such a thing? You're going to go take this animal and you're going to remove its kedusha while it's still a perfectly good korban? You're not allowed to do that. Normally you have to wait till the korban becomes develops some kind of a blemish. You can't just decide to remove the kedusha whenever you feel like it. So that can't be what it's talking about. How could that possibly be? So the answer, so he says instead, so then so Rabbi Yochanan says, no, I say like this, it's talking about a case where you found a group of animals. If the group of animals, the majority is male animals, you assume that they're all olot and you offer them as olot. If you found a group of animals and the majority is females, you assume they're all shilamim. In other words, you assume that they're all part of one group and they're all the same. So the Gemara asks, but wait a second. But can't shilamim also come from male and female? So how do you know from the fact that it's female that it's necessarily? I'm sorry, from the fact that it's that they're males. How do you know that maybe those are all shilamim? Maybe it's the majority male, but they're shilamim. How do you know that it's olot? How can you be sure? So therefore it says, what does he do? Motzi'an lachulin. Okay, he has to make them chulin. In other words, he has to remove their kedusha.
But wait a minute. Why can't you apply the previous principle of just going with the stringency of taking?
No, but look what he says to do. Ketzad will say, "Motzi'an lechulin." First, you remove their kedusha, and then v'chozer ve'oseh otan olot. What you do is you first remove their kedusha and money, and then you reconsecrate them as olot. So now you're sure, right? So you're bumping them. At worst, you're bumping them up.
But why do you do that?
Why? Because you're in trouble, right? So Amar Rabbi Zera, Kamad At Amar Taman, Tenai Bedinu Ala Motarot Sheyikarevu Olot.
There's no problem to increase the.
There is a problem. You can't take something that's actually a korban shlamim and just bring it for something else. You can never do that.
But in the previous couple of minutes of Gemara,
it's more holy for money, but not for the animal. This is the animal. No.
Okay.
Yeah. So Rabbi Ze'era says it's like you say over there. Tanai bedin wala motarot. Anytime you have a leftover animal, in other words, an animal that you don't know where it's supposed to go or it became obsolete, it should be brought as an olah. Okay. Ken at amar. So too are you saying here? That it's a rule that any lost animal we bring as an olah. So what is he trying to explain? So the simplest way to explain it is that this is all part of one answer. In other words, what it means is normally you can't remove the kedusha from an animal and then reinstate the kedusha. You can't remove the kedusha from an animal without a good reason, unless it develops a blemish. But here there is a tanai bedin. In other words, when you're makdish something, when you consecrate something, you consecrate it al dat bedin. You consecrate it on with all the stipulations of the Bet Din. That's implicit in any consecration. And what was the implicit condition? That if this animal ever becomes obsolete, ever becomes lost, or it's ownerless, lost, we don't know what its status is, that it can have its kedusha removed and made an olah. That's the condition built in. Okay, so therefore you're allowed to do it. That's why.
It's not only taking out the kedusha, but actually giving in a higher kedusha.
Maybe. So, it could be. Amar Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yaakov, Baracha, in Zemezid. Aren't you purposely removing the kedusha here? Amar, they said, Mikevan shu Tanai Betin in Zemezid. Since the rabbis instituted this as a Tanai Betin, they built into the very consecration that if this should ever be lost, this kedusha can be removed and it can be replaced with another kedusha. Therefore, it's not considered mezid. It's not considered an avera because that's how they created it. They set it up to avoid these problems that you'd be able to reconsecrate it as an olah. So unlike the first view that we just deconsecrate it and then take the money and purchase olot, which would be easier to say because even if the money was from shilamim, if you put it for olah, you're taking it higher, right? Like we said. So not like that, but instead the idea that whenever we find lost animals, we can remove their kedusha.
And which have the same problem that was brought in before, that the person who may have wanted to bring it as a shilamim will not fulfill the shilamim.
Because the shilamim is never an obligation. So it's okay.
So
it's not an obligation.
If he doesn't fulfill,
not an obligation. It's just it's we're assuming they're voluntary korban. Rabbi Yassa. Rabbi Yassa said, Adana Ataman, when I was over there in Babylonia, Shema'it kal Rabbi Yehuda shal Shmuel. I heard Rabbi Yehuda ask Shmuel, if Shiklov amet, Amar le'yiplul indava. Umotar asvi taifa shelo Rabbi Yochanan Amar Yolichem Yam Amelech, Rabbi Elazar Amar yiplul indava. We learned this. This has been repeated, this memra, this statement several times, which is that Rabbi Yehuda asked Shmuel, what do you do if you separated your machatzit shekel and then you died? He said it should go to the fund for nidava, communal voluntary korbanot, meaning those are the korbanot that when there's no other obligation going on, the community would keep things busy by taking money from this fund and making sure there were korbanot sacrifices being offered. That's where the money should go, Rabbi. And then what happens, motar asiri taifa? If the Kohen Gadol had money, or let's say he left over flour that was supposed to go to his daily korban. So it's the money from that. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, it has to go into the Yam HaMelach. We throw it into the sea, meaning you can't use it for anything. Rabbi Eliezer said Rabbi Elazar said that it can go into the Nidava. It can also go into the communal fund. This was a machloket we've learned several times. So then Asiri Taifa Shel Kohen Gadol Rabbi Yochanan Amar. So now we have another case about the Asiri Taifa. Okay, yes.
And they say came to the Yam HaMelach. It was so easy to With the Melach.
It just means you have to throw it in a place that shelo yizachru v'lo yipakdu. It has to go into a place that they can never find it. It could be probably any ocean. I think that Yam HaMelach is just the example.
Also,
It means throw it in the ocean.
It might not sink there.
And it's true. It might float.
I wonder if there was any archaeological discovery.
Yeah, hey, here's somebody's shekel. Yeah, so that'd be interesting. So anyway, Asir Taifa Shel Kohen Gadol. This daily sacrifice that the Kohen Gadol had to bring, it's a tenth of an ephah. He splits it in half. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chotzeh Ota v'achar kach mikadesha. According to Rabbi Yochanan, what he does is like this: he splits it in half, and he's makdish each part at a time. In other words, he takes the tenth of an ephah in the morning. He splits it in half. The first half he puts into the vessel to consecrate it and offers it. The other half hasn't been consecrated yet. In the afternoon, he comes back, he takes that half, puts it in a vessel, consecrates that half, and offers it. That's the way Rabbi Yochanan envisions it. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Amar, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, "Mekadesha v'char kach chotzeh ota." He says, no, what you do is first you consecrate the entire tenth of an ephah, and then you split it in half, and you offer half in the morning, half in the evening. We could understand this as basically being, what, according to Rabbi Yochanan, really it's just a measurement. In other words, it's a matter of measuring when you split it, the tenth of an ephah in half. But really these are two different offerings. One is the morning, one is the afternoon. Rabbi Shimon Lakish is looking at it as one kedusha. You consecrate the entire Asiri Taifa at once, and then you just bring half in the morning, half in the afternoon, but it's really like one thing. It's really like one entity, because you consecrate it once. You don't consecrate it twice. You consecrate the entirety, and then you split it in half. Matnita pligel Rabbi Yochanan. But our Mishnah seems to argue with Rabbi Yochanan. Why? Because it says machriv mechatza umechatza avad. Because it says that if in a case where the Kohen Gadol dies, okay, so half of it is offered and half of it is lost. So why is it lost?
Because he didn't.
Why is it lost? I mean, because in the morning he didn't consecrate it. Right? Because he took half, he split it in half. Half of it was offered, the other half was never consecrated, so what's the problem? Why is it, why does it have to be lost? So patar, they said like this, Sheken afilu ma'ot liyelechu liyam HaMelach. Because even if it were money for the Asiri Taifa, Rabbi Yochanan says it has to go to the Yam HaMelach. It has to be thrown into the Dead Sea. Certainly, if he took the tenth of an ephah of flour and he split it in half in the morning and he just took half of it to offer and then he died, that other half was definitely intended to be the afternoon, right? So if Rabbi Yochanan says that money has to be thrown into the sea, certainly the other half has to be thrown into the sea. Even though it wasn't consecrated, it doesn't matter. Its purpose was to be used for the Asiri Taifa. Just like if money was set aside for the Asiri Taifa, then it would have had to be thrown away if he died. Okay.
It's not a question of it's his and he's not available. There's no Kohen Gadol, so it can't be done.
Well, I mean, no. Even if a new Kohen Gadol comes in, he's going to have to bring his own.
So it's
a personal thing. Okay. Yeah. But the point is that Rabbi Yochanan is not in contradiction here, because even though in the morning you consecrate only half of it, and in the afternoon you're going to consecrate the other half, the unconsecrated half that you're leaving over to the afternoon is still designated to be used for the sacrifice. It's just not fully consecrated yet. So it's no worse than the money that was set aside to purchase the flour that Rabbi Yochanan would say you have to throw into the Yam HaMelach if the Kohen Gadol dies. So now we say matnita peligei al, and really it should say Rabbi Yochanan, not Rabbi Shimon Lakish, according to the Korban Aida, and according to the Gra, it should say Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, that our Mishnah also argues with Rabbi Yochanan. How so? Nimtzu shnei chatza'in kerevin u'shnei chatza'in avudin, because it says that if there's a Kohen Gadol in the morning, he offers half of his Asiri Taifa, and then he dies. And that day, bo bayom, they appoint a new Kohen Gadol. And that Kohen Gadol comes to the afternoon, what's he going to do? He also has to offer the Asiri Taifa in the afternoon, but he only has the afternoon one. So he can't take the leftover one from the first Kohen Gadol, because that was not his. And the way it has to be done is it has to be a half of an Asiri Taifa. So what does he have to do? He has to bring a whole new tenth of an ephah and split it in half and take half of it. So what happens? Two halves get thrown away. The leftover half from the Kohen Gadol that died in the morning gets disposed of, and the Kohen Gadol in the afternoon, the new Kohen Gadol, his half is going to have to be thrown away too. So this seems to be arguing with Rabbi Yochanan. Why? Because uvitane Allah, we taught about this. Mechetza rishon umechetza sheni teubar tzuratan. The two halves that aren't used, we have to leave them over to the next day and then burn them. Okay? In other words, leaving it over to the next day means we don't do anything to destroy them until they become invalidated by waiting overnight. So wait a second here. According to Rabbi Yochanan, shouldn't it be instantaneous? Didn't he say that even money designated for the Asiri Taifa, even money designated for this flour offering, once the Kohen Gadol dies, you throw it into the Dead Sea. So why would you have to wait till the next day to burn these? Why are you burning it anyway? It should go into the Dead Sea. Right? It should be discarded, not burnt. But why should you have to wait? So the answer is Patar Laka Rabbi Yishmael, that this is following this. He'll say, yes, according to me, you can immediately dispose of it. You don't have to wait overnight, and it doesn't have to be burnt. It can be dumped into the Dead Sea. But this statement is going like Rabbi Yishmael, the Amar Isaron Mikadesh, that he says that as soon as you take that tenth of an ephah, it's automatically holy. It was consecrated right away. It's not monetary holiness, it's actual holiness. And since it's actual holiness, which is different than monetary holiness is like in potentia. Okay, it's meant to be consecrated, but it's not fully consecrated yet, right? So Rabbi Yochanan, when he said that you have to throw this into the Yam HaMelach, he was talking about when it's in potentia. Okay, but actually consecrated, it has to be burnt now, and you have to wait overnight to burn it. That's because Rabbi Yishmael says that as soon as you measure that tenth of an ephah, even before you separate it into two, the vessel that measures the tenth of an ephah sanctifies the flour. And that's why there's nothing you can do.
The vessel, not the
vessel.
Not the act of measuring.
Right. Putting it into that vessel is what's going to make it become holy, and therefore it has to be left over to the next day, and it has to be burnt because it actually is like a sacrifice that became invalidated. It's not like monetary sanctity; it's like actual sanctity, and needs to therefore wait overnight, and then has to be burnt, not thrown into the Yam HaMelach. Now we say like this. כשהכהן מתקרב תחילה לעבודה מביא עשירית האיפה שלו ועובדו בידו. So the rule is that just like the Kohen Gadol every day of his service has to bring this tenth of an ephah, okay, every day he has to do that, a new Kohen who's serving for the first time also has to do that. אחד כהן גדול ואחד כהן הדיוט שעבדו עד שלא הביאו עשירית האיפה שלהם עבודתן כשרה. So whether the Kohen Gadol or a regular Kohen, they both have this idea, except that the Kohen Gadol every day, he's mechadesh b'tuvo b'chol yom tamid. He's like a new person every day. He has to bring the tenth of an ephah every day. A regular Kohen, only the first day that he serves has to do that. Either case, if they failed to bring this asrit ephah and they had already done some other service before this, this is called the minchat chinuch, the mincha of initiation. Okay, so this mincha initiation of the new Kohen, if he failed to do it, he didn't do it, and then he went and did some other service in the Beit HaMikdash, it's still kasher. But he's supposed to do it. Rabbi Manaba'e Memar Bo Bayom Shenitkarev Tchila La'avoda Bo Bayom Shenitmana Liot Kohen Gadol Mevi Shtayim. What happens if a person, so Rabbi Mana said, and it doesn't get refuted, he said that what happens if a person is, the very first day that he's coming to serve as a Kohen, he's appointed Kohen Gadol. So what does he have? A problem. He has a Minchat Chinuch he has to bring. In other words, because it's his first day serving as a Kohen. And he's the Kohen Gadol, so he has to bring in the framework of Kohen Gadol. So what does he do? He says he has to bring two. Asirit Haifa split in half. One in the morning, one in the afternoon as a regular Kohen. And also another one in the morning, one in the afternoon as the Kohen Gadol. You'll have to do both of them. Tufine. What does tufine mean? Tufine is a description of the Asirit Haifa that's brought by the Kohen Gadol. It says tufine min chat pitim. Tufine is taken to mean from the word afiyah, from the word that it was baked. Rabbi Yasa b'shem Rabbi Chanina mitagena v'achar kach ofeota. According to Rabbi Yasa and the name of Rabbi Chanina, you first have to fry the dough, and then you bake the dough. Rabbi Yacha b'shem Rabbi Chanina ofeota v'achar kach mitagena. That you first bake it and then you fry it. Okay, so everybody agrees you fry it in oil. The question is, do you first bake it and then fry it, or first fry it and then bake it? Chufine ta'afenana. Rabbi Omer ta'afena na'ah. So there are two different interpretations of the word ta'afena, or te'afena, sorry. There are two different words of that. Or actually, I think it's not from the pasuk. It's saying tofena. You should bake it na, or you should bake it na'ah, well. Or Rabbi Dosa Omer tofena riba. Okay, so there are three interpretations of the word tufine being brought here. One is bake it na. Baking it na means bake it when it's already partially cooked. Okay? Tofena na'a means bake it beautifully, or tofena riba, bake it a lot. So what are these three opinions? So he says, Atyan ilen plugvata kehenan plugvata. That these arguments are like these arguments. In other words, manda amarta tofena na'a, the one that says you have to bake it nicely, kemanda amar ofev achar kach metagana. He's saying bake it and then fry it. In other words, because if you fry it and then bake it, it's not going to come out as well. It's going to be blackened by the oil, and then you're going to bake it. It's not going to come out as well. And the one that says you should bake it when it's already partially cooked is like the one that says that you should first fry it and then bake it, because he says it should be it should be already partially cooked. Okay? So na'a means bake it and then fry it. Na means fry it and then bake it, because it has to be partially cooked. And the other opinion that isn't rehashed here was the opinion of Rabbi Dosa. Rabbi Dosa says that tufine means bake it a lot. Why does it mean bake it a lot? Meaning that you should bake it, according to him, what you should do is bake it, fry it, and bake it again. So that way you get both. It's baked. It's baked before the frying, and it's baked after the frying. So you get a double. So according to him, there's three. So okay, so those are the three opinions about how it had to be prepared. And now the Gemara says, Lo sof davar shemet ela filu nitma. Not only if the Kohen Gadol dies, but even if it became tameh, afilu nidcha mimum, even if he developed a mum that day, we have the same rules that when we take over, about taking over for him. That if another Kohen Gadol is appointed, he's going to have to bring his own, and if not, then it's going to have to come from either the Yerushim, either the inheritors of the estate of the Kohen Gadol, or from the communal fund, depending on which opinion you take. Tane, Rabbi Yehuda bar Pazi de Bardalia, that Rabbi Yehuda bar Pazi of Bardalia, vafilu nidcha mimum minayin. So he says, how do we know that? I'm sorry, maybe that's actually maybe that's just a statement. What does he say here on the side? Vafilu. This looks like there's something missing again here from the right.
Not only if the first Kohen Gadol died.
Oh, so he's just backing it up. Okay.
If he becomes ineligible on account of a permanent blemish. Right.
So it's just restating the same halacha. Right, that it's saying the same thing. Okay, so that's what he says.
So he has a mum.
Right, so he says that you don't need this extra thing because it's just repeating it. Right, so it's just repeating it, so it's not necessary to mention it according to what the grass is on the side. Yeah, that's what I figured probably was the case. Okay, so now it says Kohen Gadol Shemet. Minayin the Kohen Gadol Shemet v'lo minu acher tachtav shetei minchato kreva mishal Yerushim. So how do we know that if the Kohen Gadol dies and they didn't appoint another one, that as long as they don't have another one, then the offering has to keep coming from his heirs? Talmud Amar mi banav yasota. It says v'kohen Gadol it says that the Kohen tachtav mi banav, right? That the Kohen HaMashiach, the anointed Kohen of his children under him, will do it. Meaning that his children have to continue it on. If the Kohen Gadol dies, they have to pick it up until somebody else is appointed. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. I'm sorry, that I skipped a part. That's Talmud Amar mi banav yaseota yachol yiviena lachatzayim. So you might think that what they should do is just bring half. Talmud Lamar. That's why it tells you otah. Kula amarti, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. In other words, what's the difference? That when there's an actual Kohen Gadol serving, then they split the Asiri Taifa into two and they offer half in the morning, half in the afternoon. When there's no Kohen Gadol active right now, so what happens is that the children have to contribute every day the Asiri Taifa, but it's offered just as one sacrifice. It's not split in two because there's no Kohen Gadol to do it. So it's not necessary.
Who does it?
Same thing, nobody. He has to pay for it. He would have to pay for it then, because then he's not dead yet. There's no reason to give it to the children then. Right? Rabbi Shimon Omer Eina Ba'a Ele Mishal Tzibor. Rabbi Shimon says it comes from the Tzibor. Shenemar Chok Olam, that it is an eternal statute. Mi Shabrit Kirutalo, that it's for the one with whom the Brit was made. In other words, the Jewish people are in charge. It's Chok Olam. It's an eternal statute with the Jewish people that they have to have it. So even if there's no Kohen Gadol, it still has to be brought. And who's responsible? Not the family of the Kohen Gadol, but the community is responsible for making sure it's not done. So making sure it's done. So when there's a Kohen Gadol, he's their emissary. But when he's not around, they have to pay for it. Not his family, but the community. And then Kalil Toktar, it says it has to be completely burnt. Kalil Lahaktara, the entire thing goes for burning. In other words, that there's nothing left over to be eaten from the offering of the Kohen Gadol. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation, the Korban Haida, is that it means that it's not split in half. Everybody agrees that we don't split the offering of the Kohen Gadol in half, unless there's an actual live Kohen Gadol bringing it. If the Kohen Gadol is not around and we're just offering the tenth of an ephah each day, then we offer it without splitting it into two parts.